because it is an occasion where the professor can profess to the general public about what she does. And I think, this is my views, I think the things that professors profess about are actually quite important. We have many prophets who come up with all sorts of predictions. But when a prediction is coming out of a professor, it is normally based on sound scientific method. There has to be some evidence, and from that evidence probably a model or a theory will be built, and based on that theory then a prediction is going to be made. So Professor Jane Duncan, we are really looking forward to hearing you profess to us your trade. We would like to engage you on the ideas that you are going to put forward. And I think, once again, I would like the audience just to give you a round of applause for this important step in your life. I thought it was an inaugural lecture, not a political rally.
It's a good thing she makes the connection between both.
Okay. No, thank you very much. So, without any further ado, I'm going to welcome the Executive Dean, Professor Alexander Broadbent, to come and introduce our inaugural professor. Thank you very much.
Good evening. It's my great honour and pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Jane Duncan. She has supplied what she describes as an abridged curriculum vitae. It's still extensive, which I take as a testament to her achievements. Jane Duncan is a professor in the Department of Journalism, Film and Television here at UJ. She holds a PhD from Wits School of the Arts, as well as an MA, Honours and BA in Fine Arts from the same university. Before joining UJ, she held a chair in Media and Information Society in the School of Journalism and Media Studies at Rhodes University, which was her first academic post. She was also co-director of the Highway Africa Centre. Jane comes from a civil society background. She worked for the Freedom of Expression Institute for 15 years and was its executive director for 8 of those years. It was during this time that her interest in freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and the right to protest developed. She managed the protest of the FXI, establishing itself as a law clinic. Through the FXI, she was involved in several cases that would define freedom of expression in jurisprudence, such as South Africa Breweries International and Laugh It Off Promotions, the Black Labour White Guilt case, and the MEC for Education, KwaZulu-Natal and others, and Pillay, the Nose Stud case. The FXI also provided funding for a constitutional court case that legalised the establishment of trade unions in the military, and as a law clinic it has defended the free expression and association rights of many social and trade union movements. During her time at the FXI, Jane undertook advocacy in Parliament on several laws, including the Broadcasting Bill, its amendment, the Media Development and Diversity Agency Bill, Independent Communications Authority of South Africa Bill and its amendment, and the Film and Publications Bill and its amendment. Before joining the FXI, she worked in the Community Arts Centre movement, firstly at the African Institute for Art at the Funda Centre in Soweto, and then at the Africa Cultural Centre in Newtown. She is a member of the Right to Know campaign, R2K, and involved in its work on secrecy and securitization, the right to protest, and media freedom. She also represented higher education South Africa at public hearings held by Parliament's National Council of Provinces on the implications of the Protection of State Information Bill, or the Secrecy Bill, for academic freedom. Together with Professors Julie Reid and Viola Milton, she is founder of the Media Policy and Democracy Project, MPDP, a joint initiative of her current department and the Department of Communication Science at the University of South Africa. The MDP was established to encourage participatory media and communications policy. In its 3 years of existence, it has conducted research that has impacted on policy discussions around press transformation and accountability, media diversity, ICT policy and communication surveillance, and privacy. The MPDP works closely with R2K, and Jane has represented both organisations in Parliament and various other public fora. Most recently, she represented the R2K, the Association for Progressive Communications, and the London-based Privacy International at a United Nations Human Rights Committee hearing in Geneva on South Africa's compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and presented concerns about the South African government's communications surveillance law and practices. Her research interests have been shaped by her work in civil society, and her research work is both informed by and informs activist work. She is also involved in collaborative research activities with a worldwide network of privacy advocates established by Privacy International. She has undertaken research on the problems of consolidating a democracy and forming a mediated public sphere in one of the most unequal countries in the world. Recently, she has focused on the relationships between surveillance, power, and social control in a country such as South Africa. She has examined how national security practices are changing state-society relations and impacting on spaces for political expression, especially dissent and the right to protest. She is author of The Rise of the Securocrats, The Case of South Africa, published by Jacana Media in 2014, and later this year, UKZN Press will be publishing her new book called Protest Nation, The Right to Protest in South Africa. So, you have a record of extreme accomplishment, and it gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Duncan to continue that glittering record. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Broadbent, for that introduction, and Professor Mawala as well. I must just start out by apologising for the weather in advance. It's been extremely brave for you to attend under the circumstances. Now, what I would like to do is to present some ideas that I've developed in my past 2 books, which I've written in the past 3 years. The first one is on the rise of the Securocrats, which came out at the end of 2014. And the second one is coming out in the next couple of weeks. That is Protest Nation, and it's on the right to protest in South Africa. Now, the first book mapped the increase in the coercive capacities of the state since South Africa's fourth democracy era President Jacob Zuma came to power. But it didn't really analyse whether there are limits on the state's ability to use violence against dissenting voices. And I'm particularly grateful to Professor Peter Alexander. Where is he? Where is he? Oh, there he is. For having pointed out this oversight in my analysis at a launch that we held of the book at the University of Johannesburg. So this lecture is an attempt to address that gap in my analysis, hopefully, drawing on the contents of my second book. So since the Marikana massacre, I think there have been several journalists, academics and media commentators that have argued that South Africa is reverting to a repressive state. And some, like Ronnie Castrol's, for instance, who will speak after me, have even used the term police state to describe the current conjuncture. Now, how likely is it that South Africa will descend into a state of full-blown repression? How likely is it that there will be more Marikanas? Needless to say, being able to answer this question will have a major impact on the future trajectory of the country's politics. Now, I think at the outset, we need to recognize that the huge public controversies over police violence and police militarization mask the fact that there are actually fundamental shifts in the coercive capacities of the state. away from overt repression and towards less visible, more preemptive forms of repression. Now, what are the indicators of the shift and why is it happening? I identify at least three indicators of the shift. The first is that intelligence work has become increasingly important to stabilizing social relations. Now, surveillance provides the state with a politically low-cost form of social control, as abuses are obviously very difficult to detect given high levels of secrecy around surveillance work. But at the same time, the fear of being watched may force people to self-police their own behavior, which is something that has been theorized by Foucault in his appropriation of James Bentham's panopticon. Now, in South Africa, we've seen the state expanding its surveillance capacities over the past decade. It centralized the intelligence services into a single state security agency, in spite of the fact that the 1996 White Paper on Intelligence cautioned against this, and it's also included political and economic intelligence in its intelligence gathering mandate. But since then, signs have emerged that intelligence operatives have become embroiled in internal factional battles in the ruling ANC. A problem that was proved to exist by a commission of inquiry that was actually set up by Ronnie Kasrils when he was minister, which partly blamed the culture of secrecy in the intelligence services as a source of the problem. Now, the political intelligence gathering mandate has allowed the government to normalize spying on domestic political groupings on the most tenuous of grounds, and the Right to Know campaign has done a lot of work exposing this particular trend. A document leaked to the media and apparently summarizing the State Security Agency's national intelligence priorities for 2014, which are classified, although they should not be, and which are developed every year to guide the use of the state's surveillance capacities, states that the agency should investigate and engage in counter-planning for a so-called Arab Spring uprising prior to the 2014 national elections. Now, the agency claims it will resort to the maximum use of covert, human, and technical means to counter these threats. The document's citing of the Arab Spring, which, as we know, was a legitimate struggle against authoritarianism, is significant, I think, because it implies that this protest wave in the Arab region was essentially illegitimate. Now, in the South African context, the risk of such a priority straying from the covert surveillance of illegal political activities into legitimate activities should be self-evident, a risk that is strengthened by the agency's overly broad mandate, excessive secrecy, recent history of abuse of this mandate, and inadequate reforms to increase public accountability. Now, the risk associated with human intelligence, and what I mean by that is intelligence that's gathered through physical means, like infiltrating organizations. So the risk associated with human intelligence is that the identities of intelligence operatives could be uncovered, leading to politically costly scandals about intelligence abuses. So because of this risk, the intelligence community has taken advantage of the digital revolution to shift away from using human intelligence to signals intelligence. And signals intelligence is intelligence that is gathered from communications surveillance. Now, it's difficult to tell whether South Africa has embraced this global shift, but it would be unsurprising if it has. While the government's targeted interception capacities are regulated in terms of RICA, we know RICA, we were all told to get RICA'd, mass surveillance remains completely unregulated in terms of the law, which predisposes these capacities to abuse. Now, the second indicator, which is closely related to the first, is the shift from militarized policing to intelligence-led policing. Now, as its name suggests, this policing model uses risk assessment as its main tool to direct policing decisions, and it also relies heavily on covert techniques for crime detection. Now, the thing about intelligence-led policing, what makes it so controversial, is that it doesn't necessarily make human rights violations go away. Rather, it merely makes them less visible. Now, this form of policing encourages the problematic profiling of individuals or social groups that may resort to crime, which can lead to stereotyping of particular social groups as being predisposed to crime. Activists who are considered to be politically threatening to existing ruling groups may be placed under surveillance to gain more information about their activities and to intimidate them, which risks chilling political activity. But like overt forms of violence, generalized surveillance techniques also erode public trust in the state. In fact, the latter can do so more readily than the former, as surveillance proceeds from the premise that states do not trust their citizens. Now, in South Africa, the Crime Intelligence Division of SAPS holds the key to this new policing strategy. So it's unsurprising that this division has become so powerful and controversial in recent years, as this policing model makes it the linchpin of policing strategies. Now, SAPS, the police, have embraced intelligence-led policing for several reasons. Police violence is eroding trust between the police and communities, making it more difficult to revert back to community policing. Yet, at the same time, SAPS cannot risk many more high-profile shootouts with protesters, as the long-term political costs will simply be too great. So it stands to reason that SAPS would search for a policing model that still allowed it to contain dissent, using a less politically risky approach, and intelligence-led policing provides just such a model. Now, the third indicator is the increasing use of preemptive methods of containing protests through manipulations of the Regulation of Gatherings Act to stop more protests from spilling out onto the streets in the first place. Now, in a research study I led on the right to protest in 11 municipalities, and which involved the logging of municipal data about gatherings and protests over a 5-year period, which was 2008 to 2013, I found that none of the municipalities studied received a clean bill of health. And the full findings of that project are contained in my latest book. A research team collected all notifications for protests and gatherings sent to municipalities in terms of the Act. They yielded incredibly rich data about how many protests were taking place relative to gatherings, the reasons for the protests, the protest actors, and municipal responses to the protests. Now, the municipal and police statistics suggest that the majority of protests take place peacefully and uneventfully, which is not the dominant image of protests, either in the media or the public imagination. And I think we are likely to hear more about this tomorrow morning when the South African Research Chair in Social Change's report, which analyses thousands of records from the police database, is released. In fact, from the police's own database, the IRIS database, for the areas with the most unrest-related incidents between 2009 and 2012, located in Mpumalanga, it became clear that despite being labelled unrest-related, most of the protests did not escalate beyond barricade building and tyre burning into violence, and in fact were recorded as being fairly incident-free. The protests recorded in the municipal records constitute a humdrum of protests, taking place day in, day out throughout the country with little incident. Between the media and police hype about violent service delivery protests, it is this wider picture of peaceful protests that is so often missed, and worryingly so. The security cluster can use images of marauding mobs apparently predisposed to violence to create moral panics in the public about protests, to turn the public against protesters, even those whose demands are legitimate, and to justify heightened security measures against them. Yet, in spite of protests remaining largely peaceful, all the municipalities surveyed instituted unreasonable restrictions on the right to protest, and these have curtailed this right to varying degrees. Now, while the misapplication of the Act has been a problem at least since the early 2000s, a particularly significant shift became apparent from 2012 onwards. In the wake of the local government elections, the Department of Cooperative Governance sent out a circular to local governments that outlined proactive measures that governments needed to take to deal with protests. These measures included, and I'm quoting from the memo, working with the Office of the Speaker and public participation units to ensure ongoing engagement between councillors and communities and residents. Several municipalities used this memo as a pretext to change how they administered the Act. Now, this shift increased the already onerous bureaucratic obstacles municipalities put on protests. Practices that limited the right unduly included a requirement on the part of conveners to seek a letter from the institution or person they were marching against, guaranteeing that they would be willing to accept the memorandum. Now, this allowed those who were being marched against to squash the protest simply by refusing to make themselves available. The City of Johannesburg requires protest conveners to seek permission from a ward councillor to protest. And after the 2012 Cooperative Governance Memo, they and the Mbombela municipality instituted a filtering system to reduce the number of service delivery protests, where conveners needed to show that a meeting took place between the mayor's office, the community, and the ward councillor involved in that community, or at the very least that an attempt was made to bring all parties to the table to resolve the issues at hand. But this prescription is not lawful, as the Act does not prescribe what process people should follow before they take to the streets. The number of approved, in inverted commas, protests increased in Mbombela once the filtering system was introduced, suggesting that the potentially troublesome protests did not even enter the system. But the municipality did admit that the condition had led to an increase in the number of, in their terms, unrest-related protests taking place outside the framework of the Act. The police were more likely to be heavy-handed against such protests as they were not involved in facilitating them in the first place. These were led mainly by individuals or organizations that were in dispute with the very structures that they were meant to negotiate with, suggesting that an increasingly restrictive approach towards protests on the part of the municipality was changing the character of the protests, forcing them to become what the authorities would consider unlawful, and driving up the potential for the protests to become disruptive. Now, while the municipalities studied have gradually closed spaces for the right to protest, this closure is highly uneven and subject to considerable contestation. Spaces were much more closed, where the political and economic elite were united in their intentions to stifle protest and prevent criticism, the Rustenburg municipality being a case in point. But this unity was not found uniformly across the municipalities. So the evidence supports a view of the state put forward by Grumsky that it is not monolithic, but is rather a site where ruling class alliances take place or even shift. In times of significant political de-alignment, and we can argue that we are in such a moment, elements of the state can even work against one another. Erratic repression is likely to occur when divisions have opened up within the political elite or between the political elite and the bureaucratic layer. In some circumstances, spaces for alternative voices remained open, albeit constrained and subject to reversal. Now, internationally, we've seen that the academic literature has recognized the fact that ruling elites have expanded their repertoires of social control beyond outright repression and has shifted away from focusing on the concept of repression to that of pacification. But the fact that the elites have found it necessary to shift from more visible to less visible forms of social containment at all is not a sign, I'd argue, of their strength. Rather, it's a sign of their weakness, as they recognize the fact that they lack the capacity to repress openly. Now, why is this so? I tend to answer that particular question in the next section of the paper. Now, I think it seems fair to say that South Africa is manifesting more elements of a classic Grumskian organic crisis. Now, for Grumsky, crises become organic when they are thrown up directly by contradictions in how the capitalist system functions, when they are dynamic in that they are not confined to particular actors, events, issues, or moments in time or place, and consequently when they are a process rather than a momentary eruption. Now, the demands being raised may be diverse and at times even incompatible. This is to be expected. Such crises usually arise when a particular regime of capitalist accumulation becomes unsustainable because of its own internal contradictions. Now, in such circumstances, the ruling bloc loses its legitimacy on a mass scale. So an organic crisis develops when the following conditions obtain. Firstly, when popular capacity for action increases. Secondly, when more people can become detached from the previous hegemonic bloc and be convinced to side with the subaltern classes, using Gramsci's language. Thirdly, when there is a decline in the capacity of the state to offer significant concessions. But fourthly, when there is also a decline in the capacity of the hegemonic bloc to mobilize effective repression. Now, when these conditions obtain, the hegemonic bloc cannot offer concessions easily, yet neither can it repress very easily either. Now, with regard to popular capacity for action increasing, while the number of crowd management incidents increased year on year since 1996, too little can be deduced from this upward swing, as the police database that logs these incidents records both protests and gatherings. However, from the municipal data referred to earlier, it is apparent that protests peaked in 2011, the year of the local government elections, in municipalities such as eThekwini, Johannesburg, and Lukanji, which is when crowd management incidents recorded by SAPS peaked too. So it's not unreasonable to assume that the peaking of incidents in 2011 can be attributed, at least in part, to an uptick in protest action. Now, there was little evidence in the data that we analysed of coordination across protest sites. Coordination occurred when a trade union movement organised a national strike, or where a strike took place in different parts of the country, for instance, a public sector strike. While there was little evidence of these protests coalescing into more generalized political demands, they have the potential to, if a national political movement comes into being that links these different struggles together. Now, the municipal data pointed to high levels of organization and of new formations or even organizations emerging all the time, suggesting that Patrick Bond's term of popcorn protests, used to describe seemingly sporadic, spontaneous protests, ignored the extent of organization that actually exists. Now, there was no evidence of unions and community organizations uniting around shared grievances. However, it was apparent from the municipal data that struggles at the point of consumption are becoming as important to the political life of direct action politics as struggles at the point of production. And in some cases, in the Marikana municipality, for instance, the former are overtaking the latter as flashpoints of struggle. Now, when the South African protests are viewed in the global context, it becomes apparent that popular capacity for action is not only increasing, but these increases are being sustained. Now, I think that the protests could easily be described as a cycle in the sense used by Tarot. However, is the protest cycle in South Africa of even greater historical significance? For instance, could it be part of a broader regional or even global protest wave? Now, the question of whether the protests are part of a wave rather than being an isolated single country protest cycle is an important one, as it speaks to whether the protests will fizzle out in time or escalate into fundamental and transformative challenges to the system on a worldwide scale. Now, according to Colin Beck, the difference between a protest cycle and a protest wave is that the latter is present in at least two or more societies within a decade of each other, and these protests are tantamount to revolutionary situations. In other words, the protests affect more parts of the world over a longer period and are not concentrated in a fixed period in time or driven by a small, well-defined set of actors. And these features suggest that the unfolding struggles are responses to broader crises in the world economy. And in spite of their heterogeneity, They are capable of being sustained and even escalated into an insurrection, precipitating an organic crisis. Now, for Lawrence Cox, if protest cycles are sustained in more than one region of the world over a period of at least 15 years, then this is a further indication that the crisis is organic rather than episodic. Sustained regional disruptions actually usually happen at least once every 20 years. But the fact that some have not led to regimes falling, or where political revolutions have been achieved, they have not necessarily deepened into social revolutions, becomes less significant if revolutionary waves are understood as a process rather than an event. If these protests have brought new political actors onto the streets, resulting in new forms of organization, and extracted significant concessions from ruling elites, shaking the state in the process, then they could be described as moving in an anti-systemic direction. This is because the protests build confidence in the power of collective action, and consequently have the potential to extract even more significant concessions in future. So I'd argue that when viewed in this global context, becomes apparent that South Africa's protests are of world historical significance and point towards them being part of a broader global wave of heightened popular action. They are also likely to place popular limits on the state's ability to use organized violence, as doing so may well intensify popular action rather than dampen it, and I will elaborate on that point a little bit just now. Now, with respect to more people detaching themselves from the hegemonic bloc, the municipal data before 2011 pointed to the ANC alliance dominating the protest space, especially in smaller towns and rural areas, but that its dominance started to decline after 2011. It's fascinating to just track this in the municipal data, which you can do quite clearly. In fact, while the protests cannot be said to have a distinct ideological character, the data points to the hegemony of the ANC diminishing. This does not support arguments advanced by the likes of Susan Boyson and Ibrahim Fakir that the protests are merely about holding the ANC to account. Rather, there is a growing evidence of more communities becoming subjectively available for alternative politics to that offered by the ANC alliance. Now, with respect to Gramsci's two other conditions for an organic crisis, namely that the elite cannot offer concessions very easily, but neither can they repress very easily, the neoliberal phase of capitalism has entered a period of organic crisis in several regions of the world. In the case of South Africa, while the Zuma administration promised a more redistributive state, and undoubtedly many of its more principled office bearers remain subjectively committed to this vision, the objective conditions did not favor radical redistribution. Yet at the same time, managers of the neoliberal system need to maintain consent in order to continue ruling, which they find increasingly difficult to obtain. If they resort to coercion to stabilize the system, they risk losing legitimacy, and state violence is used most effectively when consent remains for its use. For instance, there are limits on the extent to which paramilitary policing can be used to contain growing dissent. While many police are clearly getting away with murder, public antipathy is building against the police and the political order that they seem to be propping up. There have not nearly been the same level of protests against police violence in South Africa as there have been in the US, in cities such as Ferguson. But Marikana has hastened political shifts that have been underway for some time now and has not dampened protest levels. To that extent, it has not been a particularly successful massacre for the ruling elite. The massacre was a precipitating factor in the formation of the EFF, and COSATU's largest affiliate, NUMSA, has been expelled from the federation, spurring it on to form a united front. The state cannot risk going down even further down this path. Violence against dissenters on a mass scale is likely to eat into the ANC's still considerable legitimacy and hasten its slow but steady demise at the polls. This is especially so if a national movement comes into being that generalizes protesters' demands and relates them to the neoliberal system of governance. Workers and the poor, who face the brunt of the system, are increasingly unlikely to consent to supporting and funding their own oppression. Another factor that makes full-scale repression unlikely is that the security cluster appears to be an increasingly divided house, and not insignificant cracks are beginning to show. I go into this in a little bit more detail in the written version of the paper. Furthermore, in order to repress openly, the police would probably need the assistance of the military. But the military is industrialized and unionized. There is evidence that a significant number of soldiers have a consciousness of themselves, not just as soldiers, but as workers, who are exploited like other workers. So in view of the industrial turmoil in the military, the political elite face a gamble. If the current administration put soldiers in front of exploited protesting workers and told them to shoot, what would they do? What if they refused? Can they really risk a rebellion in the military, which would amount to mutiny? The political risks could be too great for them to gamble on the military. Also, I think that the more historically aware security officials are also likely to make political calculations about how long they will last if they intensify open repression. As the embarrassingly weak presidency of Jacob Zuma splutters to a close, the ignominious fates suffered by the likes of Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi could well be top of mind when they attempt to weigh up the long-term political costs of engaging in an all-out defense of their positions. Regimes that relied on repression to maintain power have never lasted. They have always crumbled. It is not coincidental that since 2009, the year that Zuma came to office, evidence has mounted of some even resorting to political assassinations to silence their critics, especially in Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal. But resorting to informal repression is itself an indication that more violent sections of the political elite recognize that they cannot engage in open repression easily. Convictions of the perpetrators, and there have been some convictions, make it less likely that political assassinations will escalate into unstated state policy, although as the country heads up to possibly its most fractious local government elections yet, it would be naive to ignore that the risks are there. So just moving on to the conclusion, I argue that the current government's ability to offer meaningful concessions is limited, but so too is its ability to repress easily. This means that the South African political landscape bears all the hallmarks of having entered an organic crisis. Now, crises of this nature, to my mind, are not necessarily negative. They can allow fundamental societal contradictions to surface in ways that force society to confront them, grow from them, and then move forward. In spite of the fact that the current political moment seems so dark, I'd argue that the political space is in fact wide open and is actually pregnant with great promise. Now, to return to the question, does the state have the capacity to repress on a broader scale? It appears not. There are unlikely to be more Marikanas in the sense of an organized, armed assault on protesters, although the possibility cannot be ruled out that state violence could occur as an unplanned reaction to particular events. While there are clear and well-acknowledged legal limits on the state's ability to use violence, the political limits, and more specifically the limits imposed by popular agency, are less well acknowledged. This is because repression is often studied as a static structural factor constraining movement activities, and not as a factor that is changed dynamically through interactions between state structures and popular agency. Arguably, the social and political conditions that would allow the state to use ongoing as opposed to sporadic violence do not exist in this current conjuncture. as the balance of power is shifting gradually towards popular movements outside the hegemonic bloc. So no matter how powerful the men and women with guns seem, there are important signs that they are actually quite vulnerable, and the shifting modes of state repression point to that. While overstatements about the power of the coercive capacities of the state are understandable in the wake of Marikana, they are not helpful, as they can lead to fear and even political paralysis. What Cox has referred to as repression horror can lead to movements seeing the state as omniscient and omnipotent, even when it is not. But this does not mean that democratic movements must become complacent. Appropriate activist strategies to counter repression and win back democratic space are likely to be both timely and effective. On the other hand, ill-considered, misdirected ones may be ineffective. Ultimately, though, the best way of limiting state violence in all its forms is for movements to intensify popular organization and action and deepen the political shifts that are already underway. Now, these strategies are relevant for all movements seeking to bring about a just and transformed society, and who exercise their right to protest to do so, including the emerging student movement. Now, universities, including in the one where we are gathered, are autonomous institutions. They are not part of the state, but neither are they private entities either, as they perform a public function. The university's autonomy presents the student movement with something of a paradox. This autonomy is necessary for them to enjoy academic freedom. Without it, they could become mouthpieces of ruling elites, where spaces for critical inquiry are snuffed out. Yet, by virtue of their special status, they are not subject to the electoral pressures from below experienced by those in government and indirectly the state. This means that universities can become detached from the realities of the societies in which they operate. While they do not enjoy the same monopoly on violence that the state does, and which, when threatened with violence, they need to call on the state's monopoly to protect themselves, universities can deploy wide-ranging security measures without necessarily being held to account in the ways that government is. Universities should not use institutional autonomy as an excuse to fall back on excessive security powers, as doing so would constitute abuses of this autonomy. Now, recently, several violent incidents have taken place on South African campuses this year, including on this very campus. And these have included the petrol bombing of university facilities. The perpetrators have not been identified and brought to book yet. Yet rather than dealing with these incidents as individual acts of criminality, several universities have limited protest rights in a sweeping, overbroad manner, including through wide-ranging interdicts. In doing so, they've implied that the violent incidents are actually assembly offences, which feeds into prevailing media discourses and moral panics about the violent protesting mob. Moral panics that exist in spite of the available evidence pointing to the majority of protests remaining peaceful. Private security guards have been deployed on many campuses, even when they were peaceful and no protests were taking place, suggesting that a national decision had been taken to deploy them, irrespective of the actual threat levels on the ground. Surveillance measures are also being implemented, with no account being taken of the chilling effects they have on academic freedom. Now, in the wake of the September 11 attacks on the US and the more recent Edward Snowden revelations, the American Association of University Professors argued that privacy of electronic communications on campus was a condition for academic freedom, as academic communications can be sensitive. For a university to claim the right to intercept communications anytime, anyhow, anywhere undermines these principles and makes collegiality more difficult, as it communicates the message that university authorities are operating with a presumption of wrongdoing. These measures risk poisoning the academic environment and will most likely harden attitudes in ways that can only hasten the downward spiral of conflict. Now, what is so unfortunate about this downward spiral is that it echoes well-recognized, even theorized protest cycles. It could be assumed that as places of learning, including about protests, these developments would be recognized and the downward spiral arrested. But it would appear that the necessary lessons of history are not being learnt. Now, according to the social movement theorists Della Porta and Diani, protest repertoires change in interaction with the authorities in a series of reciprocal adjustments. Now, depending on the authorities' responses, some protesters may be pushed towards radicalization, where more extreme, even violent actions are engaged in, or institutionalization, where activists become sucked into official decision-making structures. They argue that political violence by protesters is rarely ever adopted overnight or consciously. Rather, in the early stages of the protest cycle, such violence is generally unplanned, small in scale, limited in scope, and often occurs as a spontaneous reaction to an escalation of force by the police. Many protesters are frightened off by the escalating violence, but small groups of protesters whose attitudes have been hardened by official recalcitrance begin to specialize in more organized acts of violence. According to Della Porta and Diani, during this process, small groups begin to specialize in increasingly extreme tactics, build up an armory for such actions, and occasionally go underground. The very presence of these groups accelerates the exodus of moderates from the movement, their term, contributing to a demobilization which only the most violent groups escape, at least temporarily. Now, I think to the extent that this cycle is now manifesting itself on several university campuses around South Africa, and it's important for us to acknowledge that the hard facts that it is still need to be established. Then the official narrative of last year the student movement was noble, but this year it has lost its legitimacy and descended into violence rings hollow. This argument fails to take into account how official overreaction to last year's largely peaceful protests may well have created the ground for this year's events. University actors must do more to break the self-fulfilling prophecy. Universities need to have the clarity of vision to recognize that more security cannot be the only response to growing campus unrest. It is the easier route for universities to say and do security in response to this unrest, but it is also the more simplistic route. In fact, it would be ironic if universities are amongst the last public institutions to learn these important lessons and an indictment of their role in society. Thank you for your patience.
Prof Marwala, Prof Broadbent, distinguished guests. I'm delighted to be here as respondent to Professor Jane Duncan's inaugural lecture. Professor Duncan recognizes that in the wake of the Marikana massacre, we may be tempted to dwell in repression horror, expecting that state violence will become the order of the day. But she argues that we should not allow emotional responses to override the need for dispassionate scientific analysis. Overstatements about the state's repressive capacities risk paralyzing democratic movements. Such statements could ignore the fact that there are limits on the state's ability to use violence to repress dissent. Her assessment of the political balance of forces suggests that the political elite may conclude that state violence has become too costly. She does not assert this as a matter of opinion, but uses extensive empirical research on the right to protest to demonstrate the growth of popular action beyond the ruling alliance. New actors and new forms of organization have emerged. Protests are building confidence in the power of collective action. Far from discouraging protests, Marikana has hastened these shifts. Emergent democratic movements in the labor arena, social sectors, and communities arguably lack muscle. As a result, these movements may not yet be strong enough to act as a brake on full-scale repression, but the research suggests that more people are becoming subjectively available for alternative forms of new liberation politics, with the potential to lead to fresh organizational forms that do just that. Duncan argues that shifts away from visible forms of state violence to less visible, more preemptive forms of repression are a sign of weakness rather than strength, suggesting that our rulers recognize they lack the capacity for open repression. Her empirically grounded analysis, which draws on her latest book, offers an optimistic message in contrast to one mired in pessimism about the future. It takes courage to talk truth to power, and there is much in these crisis-ridden times to fear from what many regard as a slide into a police state. Duncan dissects the repressive instruments of the state, shedding light on sectors where, unfortunately, many fear to tread. She cites the growth of unregulated mass technological surveillance, covert intelligence-led police investigation, and the manipulation of the Regulation of Gatherings Act. Measures such as police militarization, the undermining of the right to information, the proclivity of the president to control security and direct intelligence, hollow out our constitutional rights with disastrous implications. The defense of our hard-won democratic rights is a sacred challenge. Duncan creatively applies Gramsci's model of organic crisis in our current conjuncture. She considers the inability to offer meaningful concessions on the one hand to the declining capacity to apply repressive force on the other, relevant to the increase in popular protest. Such a situation may limp along, but the current status quo surely cannot be indefinitely maintained. The outcome lies in the antagonistic contradictions referred to by Duncan, building up and bound to come to a head in the contending clash of interests, and is pregnant with possibilities. These may range from an interregnum of either repressive or benign dictatorship, or a social compact for a more just redistributive economic system, or revolutionary situations. Such are the eventualities in which analysts such as Professor Jane Duncan alert us all to, this community as well. I share her hope that regression into a police state is avoidable, but we can only remain optimistic if the organized forces capable of fundamental change materialize. It is an honor to endorse Professor Duncan's inaugural lecture. Thank you, Siyabonga Gekulu.
So I will call upon Professor Duncan and Professor Broadbent to come forward. Okay, you have to do it.
Put it on.
Yeah, you have to put it on.
Sorry, I don't do this every day. I promise.
Nor do I.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.